The stars out here don't twinkle. That's something poets never tell you. They write about stars like they're alive, flickering, breathing, dancing in the dark. But at the rim of the Crestari expanse, where the galaxy thins out and the light from civilization is nothing more than a distant smear, the stars just sit there, cold, still, like holes punched through black paper. I had been staring at them for 47 minutes. Commander Voss. My comms officer, Petty Officer Danny Reyes, said my name the way she always did when she thought I was spacing out, which was her polite way of saying she thought I was losing my mind. Survey ping is ready. Send it, I said, and I turned away from the viewport. The bridge of the UES Persistence was not a glamorous place. It was a long, low room with too many screens, not enough ceiling height, and a persistent smell of recycled air and burnt coffee that I had stopped noticing about 3 years ago. The crew of 11 moved quietly between their stations, checking readouts, logging data, doing the 1,000 small boring things that make up 90% of deep space survey work. The other 10% is what keeps you from quitting. I settled into my captain's chair, a term I used loosely, since it was actually a padded stool with a broken armrest that maintenance had promised to fix 6 times, and pulled up the survey grid on my main screen. We were in Sector 7 Tango of the Crestari Expanse, what the Compact's official navigation charts called a low-priority debris corridor. The unofficial name, used by every human survey crew who had ever worked this region, was the dumping ground. That name was more accurate. The Compact, the great, ancient, galaxy-spanning political body that humanity had been a junior and largely ignored member of for the past 60 years, had been using the Outer Rim as a trash heap for longer than our species had been writing things down. Old ship parts, failed terraforming equipment, broken mining platforms, the cast-off debris of 100 civilizations who had outgrown their old tools and had no interest in dealing with what came next. They just pushed it out here and forgot about it. That was where we came in. The United Earth Survey Division, officially tasked with expanding humanity's knowledge of the galactic frontier, which was a very noble way of saying, picking through alien garbage for things we could use, ran 12 survey vessels in the Crestari Expanse alone. We were the 3rd smallest crew, the 2nd oldest ship, and by the quiet, unspoken consensus of everyone at UE Command who had never actually done this work, the least important assignment in the division. I had been doing this for 11 years. I knew exactly what we were, and I had made my peace with it a long time ago. Ping returns are coming in, said Reyes. She was young, 24, with the particular kind of focused energy that people have when they still believe that every new scan might be the one that changes everything. I remembered feeling that way. I tried not to hold it against her. Log them to grid, I said. Standard catalog protocol. Commander. Her voice had changed, just slightly. There's something on grid 7. I looked up from my screen. Reyes was not the kind of person who changed her voice for nothing. She had been with me for 2 years, and in that time I had watched her stay completely calm while we lost a thruster array in a debris field, while a compact customs frigate spent 4 hours searching our ship for contraband we didn't have, and while I personally made the call to fly through a micro-meteorite shower, rather than lose 3 days going around it. She didn't rattle easily. What kind of something, I asked. A big kind, she said. Mass signature is... She paused, looking at the numbers again, as if she thought they might be different if she checked a second time. Commander, the mass signature is reading at approximately 1.4 million metric tons. The bridge got very quiet. I stood up from my stool and walked to her station. I looked at the screen. I looked at the numbers. I looked at the shape the ping had returned, an enormous irregular silhouette sitting deep in the debris field, surrounded by smaller pieces of floating junk like a sleeping giant in a cloud of dust. That's not a piece of equipment, I said. No, said Reyes, it's not. I turned to my navigator, Ensign Park. Take us in. Slow approach, 1/4 thrust, lights off, shields up. Park didn't ask why. Good crew never asks why when the tone of the room is already telling them. It took us 2 hours to get close enough to see it properly. What I can tell you is that from a distance, it looked like a mountain that had learned to float. Up close, it looked like something that had been built by people who thought very differently about space than we did. The hull was not the smooth, curved metal you see on human ships. It was angular in places, strangely organic in others, with massive structures jutting from its sides that I couldn't immediately identify as weapons or antennae or decorations or something else entirely. The whole thing was dark, no running lights, no energy signatures from the outside, but even cold and silent and drifting, it carried a kind of weight that had nothing to do with its mass reading. It was enormous. I don't use that word lightly. I've seen big ships. I've been inside compact freighters that could swallow our entire vessel and barely notice. But this was on a different level. As we moved the persistence alongside its hull, slowly, carefully, our floodlights barely reaching from one end of a single structural plate to the other, I had the very clear and slightly unnerving feeling that we were a small fish, swimming next to something that had never noticed small fish existed. "Running hull markings through the compact registry," said my Xenotech officer, Lieutenant Kwame Asante. He was our specialist in alien artifacts and civilization identifiers, a title that sounded impressive and mostly involved looking at old databases. He was very good at it. "Give me a few minutes." I gave him 10. I spent them staring at the hull through the forward viewport, trying to build a picture of what this thing had once been. The weapon systems, I decided after a while, were the long, angular structures I had noticed first. They were massive, each one longer than our entire ship, and even powered down and cold, there was a purposeful quality to their design that left no real doubt about their function. Whatever this vessel had been, it had been built to fight. "Got it," said Asante. His voice was very careful. "Hull markings match Vrethkai Registry Pattern 4 Alpha, Vrethkai Ascendancy. The vessel is listed as..." He paused again. I was getting tired of pauses, but I understood them. Some information needs a moment before it comes out. "Listed as Sovereign of the Undying Throne. Class Vrethkai Heavy Dreadnought, commissioned approximately 200 years ago, decommissioned and disposal authorized." He looked up from his screen and found my eyes. 104 years ago, Commander. Vrethkai. I leaned back against the nearest console and thought about that for a moment. The Vrethkai Ascendancy was not the kind of civilization you forgot about. They were one of the oldest active empires in the Compact. Not the oldest, but old enough that by the time humanity was building its first wooden boats, the Vrethkai had already fought and won 3 interstellar wars. They had a reputation that had survived intact through 6 centuries of galactic politics. Powerful, proud, deeply traditional, and possessing the specific kind of arrogance that comes not from insecurity, but from having been right, by their own measure, for a very long time. They were also, to be completely clear, the kind of species that human diplomats were extremely careful to address politely, and human military commanders were careful never to challenge directly. And one of their dreadnoughts was sitting in a debris field in the outer rim. "What's the registry note say for disposal reason?" I asked. Asante read it out. It was short. Registry notes always were, but this one had a particular flatness to it that I found difficult to put into words. "Vessel rendered non-operational. Hull integrity compromised beyond economic viability of repair. Disposal authorized by Vrethkai High Command. No salvage rights claimed by Ascendancy. Vessel to be abandoned in Sector 7 Tango, Crestari Expanse." That was it. No further details. No catalog of what systems had failed. No assessment of what remained functional. No secondary note suggesting the vessel be towed somewhere appropriate. Just, "It doesn't work anymore. Leave it. We don't want it." They had parked a dreadnought in the galactic equivalent of an empty field and driven away. "No salvage rights claimed," I repeated. "That's correct," said Asante. I looked at Reyes. She was looking back at me with an expression that I recognized, the one that said she was thinking the same thing I was thinking, and was waiting to see if I was going to be the first one to say it out loud. "Compact Article 7 Omega," I said. She nodded slowly. Article 7 Omega was a piece of compact legal code that most species had never bothered to read carefully, because most species had never needed it. It was old, written in the early days of the Compact, when the founding members were still figuring out how to handle the chaos of 100 civilizations suddenly sharing the same legal framework. The relevant section stated, in the careful and slightly archaic language of early Compact legal drafting, that any registered Compact member civilization could claim salvage rights over any vessel or structure that had been formally abandoned by its original owner, with no salvage rights reserved, provided the original owner had been given the opportunity to reclaim said vessel within a 100-year period from the date of abandonment. 104 years. The window had closed 4 years ago. "Reyes," I said, "I need you to pull up our salvage claim forms." "Already have them open," she said. I almost smiled. Almost. We put on suits and went inside. The standard procedure for boarding an unknown derelict vessel is a 2-person team, short exploratory sweep, report back, then expand from there. I modified the procedure to include myself, Asante, and our chief engineer, Lieutenant Tomasz Brandt, a large, quiet man from Gdansk who had the particular quality of being completely unimpressed by things that impressed everyone else. I found this professionally very useful. Brandt's reaction when we cut through the outer airlock and stepped into the first corridor of the sovereign of the undying throne, was to look both ways, note that the structural integrity of the corridor walls appeared sound, and observe that the internal atmospheric seals had held reasonably well over a century of vacuum exposure. He was not wrong. He was also missing the point entirely, but I had learned not to hold Brant's practicality against him. It was a feature, not a flaw. Asante was different. He stopped 2 steps inside the airlock and didn't move for a full 30 seconds. "Kwame," I said. "I'm fine," he said. This corridor. Commander, this corridor is 40 meters wide." It was. It was 40 meters wide, easily 10 meters tall, and it stretched ahead of us into the dark for as far as our helmet lights could reach. The walls were made of something that was not quite metal and not quite ceramic, a Vrethkai composite material that I had read about in Xenotech briefings but never seen in person. It had a faint blue-gray quality to it that made the corridor feel cold even through the suit. Every few meters the walls were interrupted by structures I couldn't identify, not doors, not panels exactly, but recessed features that suggested function without revealing it. It was the largest interior space I had ever stood in that had once been a corridor. "They're bigger than us," I said. "Vrethkai. Average height somewhere around 3 meters. "I know," said Asante. "It's just different to know it and to stand in their hallway." We moved deeper into the ship. What followed was 2 hours of careful exploration through parts of the forward section. 2 hours that I will not describe completely here because we logged everything and the full record exists for anyone who wants to read it. What I will say is this: the further we went, the clearer it became that the sovereign of the undying throne had been abandoned the way a very wealthy person throws away a coffee cup, without a second thought, without any real consideration of what was being lost, because losing it cost them nothing they couldn't simply replace. The weapon systems were not destroyed. They were dormant. 3 of the 48 torpedo bays we passed were physically damaged, shearing stress fractures on the loading mechanisms, the kind of thing that could fail in combat. The other 45 were intact, powered down, out of ammunition, but intact. The fire control systems, as best as Brant could assess without power, appeared to be fully functional. The spinal railgun, the primary weapon, a barrel running nearly 3 kilometers through the heart of the ship, had a fracture. One fracture, deep in the midsection, in a part of the barrel lining that had experienced catastrophic stress at some point, probably in its last engagement. To the Vrethkai, a cracked railgun barrel on a ship this size was a disposal-level problem. They had others. Brant looked at the fracture for a long time. Then he said, "That's a weld job." "The barrel lining is a Vrethkai composite material," I said. "We don't manufacture anything compatible." "No," he agreed, "but I know what temperature range holds the molecular structure of this type of composite, and I know what materials we could use as a bridging matrix." He paused. "It would take about 4 months. But it's a weld job." Asante was very still. I kept walking. We reached the drive core chamber 2 hours into the exploration, and we stood at the entry threshold and looked at it, and none of us spoke for a while. The drive core of a Vrethkai heavy dreadnought is not a small thing. It occupied a chamber the size of a sports stadium, its primary housing rising from the floor to the ceiling in a structure that combined engineering and something that felt uncomfortably close to art, and it was not silent. It was humming. A low, constant, barely audible hum that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. After 104 years of complete abandonment, the drive core of the big sovereign of the undying throne was still producing energy output. "What percentage?" I asked. Brant had his scanner out. He checked it twice. 6%, he said. "Approximately 6% of rated capacity. 6% of a Vrethkai dreadnought's fold engine." I ran the numbers in my head, then ran them again because I didn't trust myself. 6% of the drive output specifications I had on file for this class of vessel was, I checked the math a third time, still roughly 3 times the maximum FTL capability of humanity's best current warship, the UES Valiant, which had taken 11 years and a significant portion of the United Earth defense budget to build. They had thrown away an engine that ran at 3 times our best speed, because it only worked at 6%. I sat down on the floor of the drive core chamber. I didn't plan to. My legs just stopped working for a moment, and the floor seemed like the logical place to be. Asante looked at me. Brant looked at his scanner. Neither of them said anything. After a while, I reached up and switched on my suit recorder. I had filed hundreds of log entries in 11 years of survey work. Most of them were dry, factual, and about 17 people in the entire division ever read them. This one felt different before I even started speaking, because I knew, sitting on that floor, that whatever I said next was going to be read by a great many more than 17 people. Survey log, I said. Commander Elena Voss, UES. Persistence. Sector 7 Tango, Crestari Expanse. We have located and entered a derelict Vrethkai Ascendancy heavy dreadnought. Registry designation Sovereign of the Undying Throne. Abandoned 104 years ago and classified as non-operational. I looked up at the vast ceiling of the drive chamber. Initial assessment indicates the vessel retains significant structural integrity throughout explored sections. Drive core is producing measurable energy output. Weapon systems appear largely intact. Hull compromises appear to be localized rather than systemic. I paused. They threw it away, I said. I am looking at the most powerful weapon I have ever seen in my life, and they threw it away. I clicked off the recorder. Brandt had moved to a secondary panel on the drive core housing. He was already taking readings, already pulling apart the question of how something worked with the quiet, methodical focus that made him the best engineer I had ever served with. Asante was standing very still in the center of the chamber, turning slowly, taking in the full scale of the space around us. I sat on the floor and stared at the ceiling and thought about 100 things at once, about Article 7 Omega, and Compact Law, and what the Vrethkai would say when they found out, and what the UE Admiralty would say, and how long it would take to get a salvage team here, and whether Brandt's weld job was really possible, and what it would mean if it was. It took me about 4 minutes to think through all of that. Then I stood up, dusted off the knees of my suit out of habit, and turned to my crew. Reyes, I said into my helmet comms, I need you to transmit those salvage claim forms to Compact Registry Central, Priority Channel. Her voice came back immediately. She had been waiting. Already queued, Commander. Your authorization code, and it goes. Send it, I said. And that was how humanity found its second chance. In a place no one was supposed to look, in a ship no one was supposed to want, at the edge of a galaxy that had not yet learned to take us seriously. It would learn. The salvage claim went through in 6 hours. That was the first surprise. Compact Registry Central was not known for speed. It was known for the opposite of speed, a vast, slow-moving system of bureaucratic review that had been designed by committee across 47 different species and refined over 3 centuries into something that processed routine paperwork at roughly the pace of geological change. A standard claim in an uncontested sector could take 3 weeks. A claim involving a vessel of significant size could take 3 months. A claim involving a vessel that had once belonged to a major compact power could theoretically sit in review for a year or more, while various legal offices argued about jurisdiction. 6 hours. I read the confirmation twice, standing at Reyes's station with a cooling cup of coffee in my hand, and the only explanation I could arrive at was that someone at Registry Central had looked at what we were claiming, understood immediately what it meant, and pushed it through before anyone further up the chain could stop it. Someone low enough in the system to act quickly, high enough to know what they were looking at. I made a note to find out who that person was someday and thank them properly. The confirmation was clean and complete. Under Compact Article 7 Omega, with all required conditions satisfied, registered compact member, formerly abandoned vessel, 100-year window elapsed, no competing salvage rights filed, the UES. Persistence. And by extension the United Earth Survey Division held full legal salvage rights over the vessel formerly registered as Sovereign of the Undying Throne. Vrethkai Ascendancy, hull designation VA7741 Alpha. The vessel was now, legally and formally, ours. Reyes printed the confirmation and handed it to me. I looked at the paper for a moment, actual paper, because some things you want to hold in your hand, and then I folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of my jacket. Then I went to my quarters, sat on the edge of my bunk, and spent about 20 minutes just breathing. I was not, by nature, a dramatic person. 11 years of survey work had worn most of the drama out of me, the way river water wears smooth a stone. But sitting there in my small cabin, with its single viewport full of cold stars and a folded piece of paper in my pocket that changed everything, I allowed myself 20 minutes to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then I wrote my report to the UE Admiralty. I spent 3 hours on that report. I wrote it carefully, precisely, and without exaggeration, because I knew that the people reading it would be looking for any sign that I had overstated the situation, and because I also knew that the situation did not require exaggeration. The facts, stated plainly, were already extraordinary. I included every scan reading, every structural assessment, Brandt's preliminary evaluation of the railgun fracture, the drive core output numbers, the weapons manifest as best as we had cataloged it in 2 hours of exploration, I attached the full survey logs, Asante's identification records, and the salvage confirmation from Registry Central. I sent it on a priority channel with a security classification I had never used before, one that was technically within my authority as a survey commander, but that I had always assumed I would never have an actual reason to use. Then I went back to the Sovereign and kept working. We spent 11 days aboard before the first Admiralty response team arrived. 11 days during which the 7 crew members I rotated through the exploration teams, always in pairs, always with a safety line back to the boat. Persistence. Mapped approximately 30% of the vessel's internal structure. 30% of a Vrethkai heavy dreadnought is a very large amount of space. We filled 17 data drives with scan records, structural readings, system assessments, and the careful, growing catalog of everything the ship contained. The picture that emerged was one that I kept having to remind myself was real. The weapons systems were the first area where Brant and Asante spent serious time. The 48 torpedo bays, 45 functional, 3 damaged, were each larger than our entire ship's forward section. The torpedoes themselves were gone, fired or removed before abandonment, but the launch mechanisms, targeting systems, and fire control networks were intact. Asante, who had read more Xenotech journals than any person I had ever met, identified the fire control system as a Vrethkai third-generation combat network, a system that, by compact military assessments published 40 years ago, was still more sophisticated than anything humanity had deployed. The Vrethkai had left it behind. The point defense systems, the shorter-range weapons designed to intercept incoming fire, were in even better condition than the torpedo bays. Brant, who approached everything from the perspective of what he could fix and how long it would take, spent 2 full days on the point defense network before reporting that it was, in his exact words, basically fine. He said this the way a mechanic says a car just needs a new battery, with the comfortable authority of someone who has looked at the actual problem and found it smaller than advertised. The graviton lances were the most interesting discovery of the first week. They were not listed prominently in the standard Vrethkai dreadnought specifications that Asante had on file, which meant they had likely been installed as a secondary system at some point after the vessel's original commissioning. There were 6 of them, mounted along the lower hull in pairs, each one a long, dark, barrel-shaped structure that scans identified as a focused gravitational field projector. According to Asante's reference materials, the Vrethkai had experimented with graviton weapons in the middle period of their military development and largely abandoned them, not because they didn't work, but because their cycling time between shots was too slow for the kind of fast, ship-to-ship combat the Vrethkai preferred. Too slow for the Vrethkai, I noted, did not necessarily mean too slow for everyone. The spinal railgun was the one system that drew us back repeatedly, even though, or maybe because, it was the most obviously damaged. 3 kilometers of primary weapon barrel running through the absolute core of the ship, and approximately 40 meters of it compromised by a stress fracture that had probably ended the vessel's last battle. Brant spent 3 days in that section, moving slowly along the fracture with his scanner, taking readings from every angle, occasionally lying flat on the floor to look at something at floor level, with the focused attention of a man solving a puzzle that only he could see. On the 4th day, he called me down. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a section of the fracture near its widest point. I looked. It was a crack in the barrel lining, the composite Vrethkai material that Asante had identified as a proprietary alloy, specifically engineered for the electromagnetic properties required by a railgun barrel of this scale. The crack was about a centimeter wide at its broadest, and it ran at a slight diagonal through the material in a way that Brant had previously explained meant the stress had come from a specific directional force, rather than general structural failure. "Something hit the barrel casing from outside during a battle," Brant said. "Transferred the stress inward. The material failed at its weakest natural grain boundary." He ran his hand along the edge of the crack with the absent, familiar gesture of someone who had been working with materials all his life. "The rest of the barrel is completely sound. This is the only failure point." "You said 4 months," I said. 4 months was my first estimate," he said. "Now I've had more time to think about it." "Better or worse?" "Better," he said. 3 months, maybe less, with the right team and the right materials. The bridging matrix I had in mind is a graphene carbide composite. It's not a perfect molecular match for the Vrethkai alloy, but the thermal and electromagnetic compatibility is close enough that under operational conditions, the joint would actually be stronger than the original material. I looked at the crack. Then I looked at the 3 kilometers of intact barrel, stretching away from it in both directions. "Stronger than the original," I repeated. "That's my assessment," said Brant, with the quiet confidence of a man who did not make assessments he couldn't support. I nodded slowly. I turned and walked back toward the forward section, and as I walked I was already composing in my head the addition to my report that would accompany these findings. The section I would title, Structural Repair Feasibility, which was a calm and professional way of saying, we might actually be able to do this. It was on the 6th day that we found Lazarus. The ship's AI core was located in a section of the vessel that our maps had marked as Central Command Infrastructure, a cluster of chambers near the geometric center of the ship, well protected by layers of hull material on all sides, which was exactly where you would expect the brain of a warship to live. We reached it through a series of corridors that became progressively more reinforced as we went deeper, until the final approach was through a passage where the walls were nearly 2 meters thick on each side. The AI core chamber itself was a room about the size of a large lecture hall. Most of the space was occupied by the physical housing of the system, a series of tall, dark columns arranged in a rough circle, each one connected to the others by thick conduits that ran along the floor and ceiling. In the center of the circle was a raised platform with what appeared to be an interface station, controls and display surfaces clearly designed for Vrethkai users, which meant they were somewhat taller than was comfortable for me and Asante to work at without standing on our toes. It's intact, Asante said, moving slowly around the outside of the column array. Physically intact, no visible damage. The housing is a Vrethkai standard military-grade AI enclosure. They were built to survive anything short of a direct weapon impact. He paused at one column and studied a readout panel. There's residual power. Very low, but it's not at zero. Commander, the AI system has been in low-power standby for 104 years. I stood in front of the interface station and looked at the surface of it. It was dark and unresponsive, but there was a faint quality to the darkness that was different from the dead black of a truly unpowered screen. Like something behind it was waiting. Can we wake it up? I asked. Not today, said Asante. The power requirements for a restart would exceed what we can provide from our portable units. But once we have the persistence, running a power feed into the ship's secondary grid, he thought about it. A few days, maybe less. I looked at the central column for a while. I thought about what it meant that a Vrethkai warship AI had been sitting here for over a century in the dark and the cold, alone, maintaining its own standby functions on residual power that should have run out decades ago. We'll need a name for it, I said. Asante looked at me. The Vrethkai designation is in the ship's registry. It would be a long string of phonemes that would be difficult for human speakers to. Not its Vrethkai designation, I said. A name. He understood what I meant. He thought about it for a moment. Lazarus, he said quietly. I nodded. It was the right name. I don't know if either of us could have explained exactly why, but it was. The Admiralty response team arrived on the 11th day in 3 ships, a fast courier, a preliminary engineering assessment vessel, and a security frigate that maintained a very careful distance from the Sovereign, while its crew presumably stared at it through their viewports with the same expression I imagined I had worn when I first saw it. The team leader was a rear admiral named Yusra Kamara, who I had never met in person but whose name I knew. She had a reputation in the UE Navy as someone who made decisions quickly and defended them completely, which were the 2 qualities I most wanted in the person about to determine what happened next. She came aboard the Sovereign with a team of 6 and spent 4 hours moving through the ship with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had already read everything I sent her and was now checking it against reality. I walked beside her for most of it. She asked precise questions and listened carefully to the answers, and she did not express surprise at anything she saw, which told me she had already processed her surprise privately, before boarding, where it wouldn't show. At the end of the 4 hours, we stood together in the drive core chamber, our helmet lights illuminating the vast housing of the barely functioning fold engine, listening to that persistent low hum. The engineering team will need at minimum 3 weeks for a complete assessment, she said. Full structural survey, all systems, detailed repair feasibility reports on every major component. I know, I said. This will require a classification level that hasn't been used on a project of this nature since the 3rd expansion period, she said. The security implications alone. I know, I said. She was quiet for a moment, then she turned and looked at me directly. The first time in 4 hours that she had looked at me rather than at the ship. Do you understand what you've found, Commander? I thought about how to answer that. I understand what it could become, I said. I'm not sure anyone can fully understand what it is yet. She nodded, once, like I had said something she agreed with more than she expected to. The Vrethkai will find out, she said. They monitor Compact Registry Central. When they see the claim notification, and they will see it, we can expect a formal response. The claim is legal, I said. Article 7 Omega is clear. Legal and politically comfortable are not the same thing, she said. The Vrethkai abandoned this vessel because they couldn't imagine anyone wanting it. They are going to need some time to adjust to the fact that someone did. That was a careful way of putting it. I appreciated it. What happens now? I asked. Now, said Kamara. I make a phone call. She said it simply, but there was something in her tone that told me the phone call she had in mind went a long way up a very tall chain of command. And you keep doing what you've been doing, cataloging, assessing, learning everything there is to know about this ship. She looked back at the drive core. Because if even half of what your report describes is accurate under full engineering assessment, then what we do next is going to require knowing it very well indeed. She left the following morning on the courier ship. The engineering assessment team stayed. I watched the courier burn away on its return trajectory and then turned back to face the Sovereign. Floating there against the stars with its running lights still dark and its engine still humming its quiet, patient hum. We were 11 days in. There was a great deal of work still ahead, months of it, difficult work, uncertain work, the kind that had no guaranteed outcome and no promise of easy answers. Brandt's repair estimates were preliminary. Asante's systems assessments covered only a fraction of what the ship contained. Lazarus had not yet been woken. The Vrethkai had not yet responded. Everything was still in the balance. Everything was still possible, and nothing was certain, and the size of what we had found was still expanding in my mind every day, like a horizon that kept moving further away the closer you got to it. But the claim was confirmed. The ship was ours, and humanity, which had been picking through the galaxy's leftovers for 60 years with the patient, practical dignity of people who understood that you work with what you have until you have something better, had just found something very much better. I went back inside. There was a lot still left to catalog. Titan Station smelled like metal and ambition. That was the only way I could describe it. Every space station has its own particular smell, a combination of its recycled air system, its primary industry, and the accumulated presence of the people who live and work there. The persistence smelled like burnt coffee and old wiring. Compact diplomatic stations smelled like 17 different alien atmospheres fighting each other to a draw. Titan Station, which hung in orbit above Saturn's largest moon and served as the primary hub of United Earth deep space operations, smelled like something being built. I had been stationed there for 3 weeks before the full project team arrived, and in those 3 weeks I had attended more meetings than in the previous 3 years of my career combined. Meetings with engineering division heads, meetings with xenotech specialists flown in from universities on 4 continents, meetings with legal teams who wanted to walk through every clause of Article 7 Omega one more time, just to be certain, meetings with security officers who wanted to discuss classification protocols in rooms that had been swept for listening devices before anyone sat down. The project had a name now, Project Lazarus. It was a good name. I had not suggested it. Someone in the Admiralty had landed on it independently, which told me that the right name for something has a way of finding itself. Officially, in all documents above a certain classification level, the project was referred to by a code designation that was deliberately meaningless. But among the people actually working it, it was Lazarus, and that name carried the full weight of what we were trying to do. Bring something back from the dead. Make it better than it had been before. The full project team, when it finally assembled at Titan, was 200 people. Engineers, xenotechnologists, materials scientists, weapons specialists, AI researchers, structural analysts, and a small group of people whose exact roles were described in the paperwork with a vagueness that I had learned, over 11 years of working near government projects, meant they were from an intelligence division and preferred not to advertise it. 200 people, pulled from the best of what United Earth had available, cleared to a classification level that most of them had never worked at before, and brought together in a facility that had been quietly expanded over the previous 6 weeks to accommodate them. I stood in front of them on the first full assembly day and looked out at 200 faces that were simultaneously excited, uncertain, and trying very hard not to show either. Here is what I can tell you, I said. The vessel we are going to work on is the most significant find in the history of human deep space exploration. I believe that completely. I also believe that what we do with it in the next several months will matter more than the finding itself. Finding something is luck. What you do with it, that's character. I paused. We are going to fix this ship, I said. And then we are going to make it better. That is the assignment. Nobody cheered. These were engineers and scientists, not a film audience. But I saw something move through the room, a quiet, collective straightening, a slight change in how 200 people were holding themselves, and that was enough. Brandt took charge of the physical reconstruction with the same methodical calm he brought to everything, which was fortunate because the physical reconstruction was neither methodical nor calm in its early stages. It was loud, complicated, and full of the specific kind of creative argument that happens when very intelligent people with different specialties all have strong opinions about the same problem. The first major challenge was power. Before anything could be properly assessed, repaired, or modified, Sovereign needed a reliable power supply. Its own drive core was producing 6% output, which was enough to feel and measure but not nearly enough to run ship systems. The solution Brandt's team arrived at was to tether 3 of Titan Station's industrial power generation units directly to the Sovereign's secondary power grid through a custom-built interface that took 3 weeks and considerable creative engineering to design and install. Because human power systems and Vrethkai power infrastructure were not designed with each other in mind, and connecting them required solutions that existed in no manual anywhere. The team that solved the power interface problem was led by a young engineer named Specialist Rosa Navarro, who was 27 years old and had never worked on anything larger than a UE frigate before being assigned to Project Lazarus. She solved it by ignoring what both systems were designed to do and focusing entirely on what they were actually doing at a fundamental electrical level, which was a distinction that sounds simple and is anything but. When the interface came online and the Sovereign's secondary grid lit up for the first time in 104 years, the control room at Titan Station went very quiet for about 3 seconds, and then erupted into the kind of noise that only happens when something works that people weren't entirely sure was going to work. I was in the control room when it happened. I did not erupt into noise. I sat in my chair and felt something settle in my chest that had been slightly unsettled since the moment I sat on the floor of the drive core chamber and looked up at that ceiling. Then I stood up and went to find Brandt, because the next phase was starting. Lazarus woke up on a Tuesday. I was there. I had made a point of being there, because I had a feeling, not a professional assessment, just a feeling, that how the first conversation went would matter. Asante was there too, because he knew more about Vrethkai AI architecture than anyone else on the project. Brandt was there because he was always there, quietly, like gravity. The power-up sequence took 4 hours. Asante walked it carefully, step by step, following the protocols his team had reverse-engineered from the AI system's hardware architecture over the previous 3 weeks. Each stage of the restart had to be completed correctly before the next could begin, and there were 17 stages, and several of them required judgment calls in the moment that no protocol document could fully anticipate. At the end of the 4th hour, the interface platform in the AI core chamber came to life. Not dramatically, not with a flash of light or a sudden burst of sound. The display surfaces simply shifted from dark to a deep, even blue, and a single line of text appeared in Vrethkai script across the primary display. Asante read it. It says, "System integrity verification in progress. Please stand by." We stood by for 11 minutes. Then more text appeared. Asante translated in real time, his voice careful and precise. Verification complete. Core systems nominal. Peripheral systems status degraded. Crew presence detected. 3 biological signatures. Human classification. Query: what is the current operational status of this vessel? I stepped forward to the interface. Asante had prepared a translation protocol, a way of inputting text responses that the system could read, and I used it now, typing slowly while he confirmed each word. I wrote, "This vessel has been under salvage assessment by United Earth Survey Division. We are your current crew." The response came after a pause of about 30 seconds, which Asante explained was the AI processing something it had not been designed to process. Clarification requested. United Earth. This designation is not in my registry. Species classification. Human. Compact member status of human civilization. Junior member. I typed. Registered for 60 years. Another pause. This vessel's last registered crew complement was 4,247 Vrethkai personnel. Current detected crew, 3 personnel. Current vessel status, non-operational by Vrethkai Ascendancy Assessment. Salvage claim status. Legally confirmed. I typed. Under Compact Article 7 Omega, this vessel is now United Earth property. The longest pause yet, 47 seconds, I counted. Understood. Designation for current commanding officer? Commander Elena Voss, I said out loud, and Asante typed it. Commander Voss, I have been in standby mode for 104.3 years. My records indicate the Vrethkai Ascendancy determined this vessel to be non-operational and authorized its disposal. I am aware that this assessment was made. I am also aware that I am currently active and responding to queries, which represents a condition the disposal assessment did not account for. There was something in that last sentence, in the precise, careful way it was constructed, that made me look at Asante. He was looking back at me with an expression that said he had noticed the same thing. "Lazarus," I said, and Asante typed it. "We are going to repair this ship. All of it. We would like your assistance." The response this time was almost immediate. "What do you require?" And that was how it began, not dramatically, not with a grand declaration, but with 4 words that were, in their quiet way, everything. A system that had been sitting alone in the dark for over a century, that had been told it was worthless and left to drift at the edge of the galaxy, had just been asked if it wanted to help. It said yes. The months that followed were the hardest and most interesting of my professional life, which was a combination I had not previously understood was possible. The work itself was a daily negotiation between what we knew and what we were figuring out in real time. Brandt's railgun repair team spent 6 weeks on the barrel fracture alone. The graphene carbide bridging matrix he had proposed turned out to be exactly as sound in practice as in theory, but applying it correctly to a 3-kilometer precision instrument required tolerances that pushed the limits of every piece of equipment the team had access to. They exceeded those limits through a combination of engineering precision and the specific kind of creative stubbornness that made Brandt's teams consistently perform above expectation. On the day they sealed the final section of the repair and ran the first magnetic field test through the restored barrel, Brandt sent me a single message. It said, "Stronger than the original, as promised." I saved that message. Lazarus became essential within the first 2 weeks of being active. The Vrethkai AI had complete schematics for every system on the ship. Not the partial technical documents that Asante had been working from, but the full, detailed, internal specifications that the Vrethkai High Command had used when the vessel was first built. It shared everything without hesitation, answering technical questions from Brandt's engineering teams with a precision that cut weeks off the assessment timeline for system after system. But Lazarus was also, in those early weeks, deeply confused. It was designed for a crew of 4,247. It had 3. It was designed for Vrethkai operational doctrine, fast, aggressive, honor-based tactical approaches that assumed a certain scale of force and a certain type of opponent. The 200 humans who gradually filled its corridors did not behave like 4,247 Vrethkai warriors. They argued with each other constantly. They made jokes about things Lazarus did not have reference frameworks for. They stopped working at irregular intervals to consume food and beverages at their stations, which was not standard in any operational protocol Lazarus had on file. Lazarus noted all of this. It filed observations. It asked questions. Through the interface. With the careful curiosity of a system that had been designed to learn and had just been given a great deal of new material to process. Most of its early questions went to Asante, who had set up a secondary interface terminal in his workspace and had taken on the informal role of Lazarus's primary conversational contact. He reported their exchanges to me regularly, partly because it was his job and partly because some of them were genuinely worth hearing. Query. Lazarus had asked one afternoon, according to Asante's log. Engineer Specialist Navarro has been working on the secondary power routing system for 14.3 consecutive hours. Standard Vrethkai crew rotation protocols would have required her relief 6.3 hours ago. Query. Is this crew member's extended operation an indication of system emergency? Asante had answered. No, she wants to finish the section she's working on. Clarification requested. Personnel comfort preferences are not a recognized operational parameter in standard crew management protocols. They are in ours. Asante had written back. A pause, then. Noted. Logging as human operational parameter. Designation. Task completion preference. I read that exchange and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not quite pride, something adjacent to it. The hardest conversation during those months was not with Lazarus. It was with the Vrethkai. The formal protest arrived at UE Admiralty headquarters 8 weeks after the salvage claim was filed, which was faster than anyone had expected and slower than I had feared. It came in the form of a compact-level diplomatic communication, not a legal challenge, which would have required the Vrethkai to engage with the legal text that clearly supported our claim, but a political objection, which was a different instrument and a harder one to answer directly. The communication expressed, in the formal and somewhat elaborate language that Vrethkai official documents always used, the Ascendancy's position that the vessel in question represented a matter of Vrethkai cultural and military heritage, and that its acquisition by a junior compact member without prior consultation with the Ascendancy was contrary to the spirit of compact cooperative principles. It did not claim the ship. It did not cite a specific legal mechanism by which the claim could be reversed. It simply expressed the objection and waited. The UE ambassador to the compact, a career diplomat named Harlan Osei who had been navigating compact politics for 23 years, responded with a document that I read 3 times because I admired it enormously. It was 2 pages. It cited, in order, the specific compact legal provisions that governed the salvage claim, the date on which the Vrethkai Ascendancy had filed no competing claim, the date on which the 100-year window had formally closed, and the legal confirmation from Compact Registry Central. Then it expressed with complete diplomatic sincerity the United Earth's deep respect for Vrethkai cultural heritage, and its readiness to discuss any matter of mutual interest through appropriate compact channels. It was a document that said in the most polished possible terms, the law is clear, we followed it, and we are very happy to talk about something else if you prefer. The Vrethkai did not respond for 3 weeks. When they did, the response was a single formal acknowledgement of receipt, which was Vrethkai diplomatic language for, we are not happy, we cannot do anything about it, and we are not going to pretend otherwise by engaging further. Kamara forwarded it to me with a brief note attached. They know, they're adjusting, keep working. I kept working. The name came at the 5-month mark, when the ship had been sufficiently restored that Brandt was willing to say, in his careful way, that the primary systems were approaching operational status. Not complete, there was still significant work ahead, but approaching. I gathered the core team in the main assembly corridor, a Vrethkai corridor that was still 40 meters wide, still 10 meters tall, still slightly too large for humans in a way that we had all quietly stopped noticing, and I told them we needed a name, not its Vrethkai designation, not a classification number, a name. I asked for suggestions and received 17 in the first 10 minutes, which was more than I expected, and included several that were creative in ways I appreciated but couldn't approve for official registry. Then Ensign Park, who had said almost nothing during the discussion, raised his hand. Monument, he said simply. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when the right word enters them. Explain it, I said, because good names deserve explanation even when they feel obvious. Park thought for a moment. It's what survives, he said. When everything else is gone, when civilizations fall and time passes and things are forgotten, monuments survive, not because someone is protecting them, because they were built to last and because someone decided they mattered. He paused. We decided this mattered. I looked around the room at the faces of the people who had spent 5 months of their lives on this project, who had eaten meals in Vrethkai corridors and slept in temporary bunks set up in chambers designed for beings twice their size, and argued and innovated and refused, consistently and without complaint, to accept that something was impossible, simply because it was difficult. Monument, I said. That's the name. There was no vote. There didn't need to be. Some decisions are not close. The test fire happened 6 weeks later. We had towed a decommissioned deep space mining platform to a safe distance, a structure about 2 kilometers long and 800 meters wide, heavy enough to register clearly on targeting sensors, and large enough to give the test meaningful scale. Brandt's team had prepared the railgun with a thoroughness that bordered on ceremonial, checking and rechecking every component of the restored system 3 times over. I stood at the command interface on the bridge, a bridge that was slowly, carefully being adapted for human operators while preserving its Vrethkai structural integrity, and I looked at the targeting display, and then at Brandt, and then at Asante, and then at the display again. Lazarus, I said, are you ready? All systems nominal. It responded through the bridge speakers, its translated voice calm and precise. Commander, may I note that the repair to the primary barrel has resulted in measurable improvements to field uniformity over the original specification. The shot will be cleaner than any this vessel has previously fired. I looked at Brandt. He said nothing, but one corner of his mouth moved slightly upward, which from Brandt was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Fire, I said. The sound was not what I expected. I had expected something massive and overwhelming. What I got was a deep, resonant pulse, felt more than heard, that traveled through the floor and up through my feet and into my chest. The targeting display showed the projectile travel time in fractions of a second. The external camera feed showed the mining platform, and then the mining platform was no longer a platform. It was a very large collection of rapidly expanding debris, tumbling away in a perfect radial pattern from a central point that no longer existed. Because the central point had been where the projectile arrived, and nothing had been in a condition to remain after that arrival. The bridge was silent. "Well," said Brant after a moment, "stronger than the original." I looked at the debris field expanding slowly on the camera feed and thought about a crack in a barrel lining that the Vrethkai had decided was not worth fixing. I thought about Lazarus sitting alone in the dark for 104 years. I thought about a piece of folded paper in my jacket pocket and a salvage claim that had gone through in 6 hours, and a mining platform that was no longer a mining platform. Then I straightened up from the command interface and turned to face the bridge crew. "Good work," I said. "All of you. Every single one." And then I went back to work, because there was still a great deal left to do, and the monument was not finished yet. Neither were we. The orders came on a Wednesday morning, which felt appropriately ordinary for something that was not ordinary at all. I was in the middle of a systems review with Brant when Reyes forwarded the communication to my personal terminal with a flag that meant it required immediate attention. I excused myself, stepped into the corridor, and read it standing up because somehow sitting down felt wrong for the moment. The orders were concise. Admiral Kamara had a gift for concise. A United Earth humanitarian convoy, 14 vessels carrying medical supplies, agricultural equipment, and water processing units destined for 3 human colony settlements in the Dravathi contested corridor, had been stopped at a Gorak hegemony blockade point for 11 days. The convoy could not turn back, because the settlements it was supplying were in a critical shortage situation that the convoy's cargo was specifically assembled to address. It could not push through, because 4 Gorak cruisers were sitting across the transit lane with weapons charged, and a demand that the convoy pay a passage fee that amounted to roughly 60% of its total cargo value. This was not unusual behavior for the Gorak hegemony. They were a mid-sized species, not a major power, not a minor one, with a long history of exploiting the transit lanes through their region of space to extract payments from convoys that had no practical alternative route. The Compact had resolutions against this practice. The Gorak ignored the resolutions because the major Compact powers found the Gorak useful enough in other ways to avoid a serious confrontation, and because the species most frequently targeted by the blockades were smaller civilizations and humanity, both of which the major powers were comfortable being concerned about without being moved to act. The convoy had been there for 11 days. The settlements were now in a critical situation. The standard diplomatic channels had produced, in 11 days, 4 formal expressions of concern and no actual assistance. Kamara's orders to me were 3 sentences. The first established the situation. The second authorized the deployment of UES or monument to the Dravathi corridor. The third was simply, "Use your judgment, Commander. Bring the convoy through." I stood in the corridor of the monument and read those 3 sentences twice. Then I folded my personal terminal closed, went back into the systems review room, and told Brant we were leaving in 6 hours. He looked up from his work. "Is the ship ready?" It was the right question. We had been operational for 8 weeks. 8 weeks of careful testing, gradual system activations, crew orientation, and the slow process of learning how to operate a vessel that had been designed by a completely different species for a completely different crew. Monument was functional. It was not by any strict definition finished. There were secondary systems still being calibrated, sections of the ship that remained unmapped, and a crew of 200 that had been doing extraordinarily well at learning their stations but had never operated under actual field conditions. "No," I said honestly, "but close enough for what we need to do." Brant nodded once and started putting his tools away. He never wasted time arguing about decisions once they were made. It was one of the things I valued most about him. The transit to the Dravathi corridor took 19 hours at the monuments. Current operational drive capacity, a figure that would have seemed remarkable 6 months ago and now felt almost modest, given what the drive was theoretically capable of at full restoration. I used those 19 hours the way commanders use transit time, reviewing intelligence, running simulations, and talking to my crew. The intelligence picture on the Gorak was not complicated. They were a species that had built their regional influence entirely on the calculation that confrontation was not worth the cost to anyone powerful enough to actually stop them. Their cruisers were capable ships, well-maintained, well-armed by mid-tier standards, crewed by personnel who knew their business. They were not, by any assessment available to me, designed or trained for engagements against a Vrethkai heavy dreadnought. The question was not whether we could get the convoy through. I was fairly confident we could. The question was how we did it, what message we sent, not just to the Gorak but to everyone watching. Because in compact space, something watched by neutral observers was always, in some sense, watched by everyone. I spent the 9th hour of transit in the AI core chamber, talking to Lazarus. This had become something of a habit over the previous weeks. Not a formal briefing, not a technical consultation, but a conversation. Lazarus had developed over 8 weeks of constant contact with 200 humans, a facility for something that was not quite small talk but was adjacent to it. It asked questions that were precise but not purely technical. It made observations that were sometimes unexpectedly insightful. It was, I had decided, genuinely curious, not in a programmed way, but in the way that a mind becomes when it has been given new things to think about after a very long time with nothing. Lazarus, I said, settling into the chair that Asante's team had installed near the interface platform. Tell me about Gorak combat doctrine. The Gorak hegemony utilizes a pressure-based tactical model, it said. Their standard engagement protocol relies on numerical presence and weapons demonstration to induce compliance before actual combat begins. Their cruiser-class vessels carry significant forward armament but limited lateral coverage. In a direct engagement, their preferred response to unexpected resistance is coordinated withdrawal to a defensive formation, rather than escalation. They back down when pushed, I said. That is a simplified but accurate characterization. Their strategic record suggests that they calculate the cost-benefit of each engagement in real time. When the projected cost of continuing exceeds the projected benefit, they disengage. A pause. Commander, may I ask a question? Go ahead. You intend to make the projected cost very high without actually initiating combat. It was not a question. That's the goal, I said. I have studied human strategic history during my operational period. This approach appears frequently in your military record. You attempt resolution before destruction when resolution is possible. We prefer it, I said. The Vrethkai did not share this preference. Lazarus said. There was nothing critical in the statement. It was simply an observation. Their doctrine prioritized decisive early action. Demonstration of capability was considered a secondary step, used only when the opponent had already demonstrated they would not yield to direct confrontation. Different approaches, I said. Yes, said Lazarus. I am finding the differences instructive. I stayed in the chamber for another hour, and we talked about other things, about the convoy, about the Dravathi system's astronomical features, about a question Lazarus had about why human crew members referred to the ship by name, rather than by its hull classification number, which it found a curious practice. I explained that names made things real to us, in a way that numbers didn't. It considered this for 17 seconds. I find this reasonable, it said finally. I did not have a name before. I find that I prefer having one. We came out of FTL at the edge of the Dravathi corridor at 0340 station time, which was the middle of what most of my crew used as their night cycle, because that was when I wanted us there. Not because darkness mattered in space, but because arriving before your opponent expects you matters everywhere. The convoy was on long-range sensors within 4 minutes. 14 blips clustered together at a holding position 12,000 kilometers from the blockade point, patient and still. The Gorak cruisers were there too, 4 of them, arranged in a loose line across the transit lane, their configuration exactly as the intelligence briefings had described. What the intelligence briefings had not fully conveyed was how the monument felt at this moment. I had been on the bridge of our ship in transit, in testing, in all the careful controlled conditions of the past 8 weeks. I had never been on the bridge and approached to a situation that was real. The difference was not technical. The systems were the same, the crew was the same, the ship was the same. The difference was in the air, in the way every person at every station sat slightly differently, in the quality of the silence. The monument felt awake in a way it hadn't before. That sounds like something a poet would say and not a commander, but it was the most accurate description I had. The ship felt present. All stations, status report, I said. The reports came in clean and quick. Weapons systems nominal. Drive at operational capacity. Point defense active. Shields at full. Lazarus confirmed all primary systems green through the bridge speakers. Its translated voice calm and steady. And I realized as it spoke that this was the first time Lazarus had performed this function in a real operational context, rather than a test. It sounded exactly the same as it always did. I found that reassuring in a way I hadn't expected. Open a channel to the Gorak blockade commander, I said. Standard compact hailing frequency. Reyes, who had come aboard the Gans monument. From the Persistence. Along with most of the original crew, because I had not been willing to leave the people who found this ship behind when it went somewhere real. opened the channel without hesitation. The response took 4 minutes, which told me the Gorak commander had taken time to look at his sensors before responding. Good. I wanted him to look at his sensors. The face that appeared on my communication screen was broadly humanoid in the way that many compact species were, with differences that were significant without being dramatic. A wider, heavier head structure, iridescent patches across the upper cheekbones that I knew from xenobiology briefings were related to emotional signaling, a formal uniform that was dark red with gold markings indicating command rank. He was looking at something off-screen when the feed opened. His own sensor readout, I assumed. And when he turned to face the camera, his expression was professionally composed. But the iridescent patches on his cheekbones were doing something that his expression was trying very hard not to show. "Unidentified vessel," he said, through the translation software, in a voice that had clearly been prepared to be authoritative and was working somewhat harder than usual to maintain that quality. "You are entering a controlled transit point of the Gorak hegemony. Identify yourself and state your purpose." "Commander Elena Voss," I said. "UES? Monument. United Earth Navy. Our purpose is to escort the humanitarian convoy currently at this position to its destination in the Dravathi system." A pause. Not a long one, but long enough. "The convoy is subject to standard Gorak transit assessment," he said. "Until the assessment fee is settled, no vessels may pass this point." "I understand your position," I said. "I want to be straightforward with you, Commander, because I think straightforward saves time for both of us. The assessment fee you've described represents a significant portion of cargo that is intended for colony settlements in critical shortage. That cargo is going through. We can discuss the most convenient way to make that happen, but the outcome is not something I'm prepared to negotiate." The patches on his cheekbones moved. A rapid shimmer, quickly controlled. "You are one vessel," he said. "We are 4. And this is a hegemony designated." "Lazarus," I said, without taking my eyes off the screen. "Activate forward weapon systems. Full power. Do not target anyone. I want it visible on sensors." "Forward weapon systems active," Lazarus said. "Energy signature at full operational output, confirmed visible on Gorak sensor range." I watched the Gorak commander's face. I watched the patches. The thing about a Vrethkai heavy dreadnought powering up its forward weapons array is that it is not a subtle event. The energy signature is enormous. The 4 Gorak cruisers, which had been sitting with casual confidence in their transit lane, were now looking at sensor readings that were telling them something very different from what they had expected to see when an unidentified vessel hailed them at 0340. "Your 4 cruisers are good ships," I said, keeping my voice level and my expression neutral. "Their crews are capable. I have no interest in any outcome that involves harm to them or to you. I have significant interest in the convoy reaching its destination. Those 2 things can both be true at the same time, and the way they stay true at the same time is if the transit lane is clear when we come through." I paused. "I'll give you 10 minutes to talk to whoever you need to talk to." I nodded to Reyes and she muted the channel. The bridge was very quiet. I could feel my crew not looking at me, which is a specific sensation. The awareness of people being carefully professional about something they very much wanted to look at. "Lazarus," I said quietly, "what are the Gorak ships doing?" "Cruiser formation has shifted from blockade configuration to lateral spread. This is consistent with preparation for withdrawal maneuver, rather than engagement positioning. Communication traffic between the 4 vessels has increased significantly. Additionally, Commander, there is a compact neutral observer beacon active in this sector. A Melthani trade vessel is at long range. They are recording." Good. I had noticed the Melthani beacon on the way in, and said nothing about it to anyone, because I had not wanted the awareness of being observed to change how my crew behaved. They behaved correctly when no one was watching. That was the kind of crew I wanted. 8 minutes passed. Then the channel reopened. "Commander Voss." The Gorak commander's voice had changed very slightly, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who didn't know what to listen for would notice. The patches on his cheekbones were still. "The hegemony is prepared to exercise discretionary authority to waive the transit assessment in this instance, as a gesture of goodwill toward United Earth." I kept my face composed. "That's a generous gesture. We appreciate it." "The convoy may proceed," he said, and closed the channel. I brought the convoy through personally. The monument moved to the front of the 14-vessel formation, and we transited the corridor at a pace that the convoy ships could match, which was considerably slower than we could have managed alone. I watched the Gorak cruisers on the sensor display the whole way. They had pulled back to a distance that was clearly deliberate, clearly a choice to be visibly non-threatening, and they held that distance without deviation until we were through. The convoy's lead ship, a UE transport called Kestrel, sent a short message as we cleared the blockade point. It was from the transport's captain, a veteran cargo hauler named Marisa Chen who had, according to her file, been making runs through difficult transit lanes for 20 years. The message said, "We've been sitting here 11 days. I had started to think nobody was coming. Thank you." I sent back, "Sorry for the wait." It was not eloquent. It was the best I had. The aftermath of the Dravathi corridor incident, as it came to be called in compact diplomatic circles, unfolded faster than I expected and in more directions than I had anticipated. The Melthani observer vessel's recording was, apparently, shared. That was what neutral observers did. It was their function in the compact system, the reason they were given special registry status, and the reason every major transit lane had at least one active beacon. The footage was not dramatic. It showed a large vessel arriving, a short communication exchange, a blockade withdrawing, and a convoy passing through. 7 minutes of recorded material. But 7 minutes was enough. By the time the monument had delivered the convoy to the outer edge of the Dravathi system and confirmed all 14 vessels were on final approach to their destinations, my communications queue had 17 incoming hails from vessels and stations I had never previously communicated with. 3 were from species I recognized immediately. 4 were from species I recognized by name but had never had direct contact with. The remaining 10 were from species whose registry designations I had to look up. None of them were from the Gorak. None of them were from the Vrethkai either, but I noticed their absence in a way that felt deliberate. The specific silence of a very large presence choosing not to speak, which is a different thing entirely from simply having nothing to say. I was sitting on the bridge going through the communication queue when Reyes turned from her station. "Commander," she said, "I've been monitoring the Compact General Broadcast Network. The Dravathi incident is on the main news feed." "What are they saying?" She thought about how to summarize it. "They're describing the monument as a United Earth warship of unknown classification." She paused. "There's a lot of speculation about where we got it." "What kind of speculation?" "The polite kind says we built it ourselves," she said. "The less polite kind says we stole it." "And the accurate kind?" "The accurate kind," she said, "is that we found something no one else wanted and we made it work." She said it simply, without drama, as a statement of fact. I looked at her for a moment. "That's exactly right," I said. I turned back to the communications queue and started going through it from the beginning. Most of the hails were curiosity, some were caution, and a few had the careful exploratory quality of something that might, if handled correctly, become something more than a hail. I answered all of them personally. It took most of the night. Somewhere in the 4th hour of responses, Lazarus spoke through the bridge speakers, quietly enough that only I could hear from where I was sitting. "Commander, the convoy has arrived at its destination. All 14 vessels have confirmed safe delivery of cargo. The shortage situation in the 3 settlement colonies is now resolved." "Thank you, Lazarus," I said. "You are welcome," it said, and then, after a short pause, "Commander, I have been processing the events of today. In my operational history under the Vrethkai Ascendancy, this vessel's function was the projection of force to compel submission. Today its function was the delivery of medical supplies and agricultural equipment to colony settlements." I waited. "I find I prefer today's function," it said. I looked out at the stars, steady, cold, and still, and felt something that took me a moment to identify because it had been a while since I had felt it so clearly. It was pride, not the loud kind. The quiet kind that sits in your chest and doesn't need to announce itself. "So do I, Lazarus," I said. "So do I." 3 weeks after the Dravathi corridor incident, I received a communication that made every other communication I had ever received feel, by comparison, like ordinary background noise. It came through official compact channels, formatted with the specific legal designations that indicated it originated from a compact recognized military authority, rather than a civilian or diplomatic source. The translation software rendered it in clean, formal language that left no room for misunderstanding. I read it twice standing at my desk, then printed it, actual paper, again, because some things you want to hold, and sat down. The communication was from the Vrethkai Ascendancy High Command. It informed me, in the elaborate formal language that Vrethkai military correspondents always used, that a Vrethkai fleet element currently operating in the Krestari sector had been directed to intercept the vessel currently designated UES Monument at the earliest practical opportunity. The purpose of this intercept was to formally address what the communication described as the unauthorized operation of a vessel of Vrethkai Ascendancy heritage by a non-Ascendancy crew. It further informed me that the fleet element consisted of 7 vessels of the line, commanded by Fleet Admiral Keth Varan of the Vrethkai 3rd Expansion Fleet, and that Admiral Varan expected a response to this communication within 48 hours, confirming that the monument would hold its current position for intercept. 7 vessels, a fleet admiral, 48 hours. I sat with the paper in my hands for a while and thought about several things in sequence. I thought about the legal position, which was solid, clearly defined, and had already been confirmed by Compact Registry Central. I thought about the military position, which was more complicated, not because I doubted the monument's capability, but because I had serious concerns about what a military engagement with the Vrethkai would mean for humanity's standing in the Compact, regardless of who came out ahead. I thought about what Kamara would say when I forwarded this to her, which I was going to do immediately. Then I thought about something else entirely. I thought about the fact that the Vrethkai had built this ship, that somewhere in the records of the Vrethkai High Command, there were engineers who had designed these corridors, these systems, this drive core. There were tactical planners who had written the operational doctrine that Lazarus had been trained on. There were, somewhere, people, and I use that word in its broadest possible sense, who had looked at the sovereign of the undying throne 104 years ago and decided it was no longer worth their time. And now one of their fleet admirals was coming to tell me I wasn't allowed to have it. I put the paper down, picked up my terminal, and forwarded the communication to Kamara with a brief attached note. The note said, "I have an idea about how to handle this. It does not involve weapons. I would like your authorization to proceed. I will explain when I call." Her response came back in 11 minutes. It said, "Call now." The conversation with Kamara lasted 2 hours. She listened more than she spoke, which was characteristic of her and one of the reasons I respected her judgment. I laid out the approach I had in mind, walked through the reasoning, identified the risks, and answered her questions with as much precision as I could manage. When I finished, she was quiet for about 30 seconds. "You want to invite a Vrethkai fleet admiral onto this ship," she said. "Under compact legal protocol," I said. "Formal dispute resolution. We request a compact arbiter. We conduct the proceeding on neutral ground, which the monument qualifies as, since it is now registered UE property, and we let the law do what the law is designed to do. The Vrethkai do not typically submit to legal arbitration with junior compact members," she said. "No," I agreed, "but this isn't a dispute between a junior member and the Vrethkai Ascendancy. It's a dispute about a specific legal claim that has already been confirmed by Compact Registry Central. The Vrethkai can choose not to participate, but if they choose not to participate, the existing ruling stands and they have publicly declined to engage with the Compact's own legal system." I paused. "They won't like that option either." Another silence. "You're betting that they'll come," she said. "I'm betting that their pride won't let them not come," I said. "They want to see the ship. They want to make their position known in person. They want to look at the humans who claimed their dreadnought and say what they think of that, face to face. Arbitration gives them a formal framework to do all of that without anyone having to fire anything." Kamara thought about it for a long time. "Then, if this goes wrong, I take full responsibility," I said. "The decision is mine." "That's not what I was going to say," she said, with a slight edge that told me I had interrupted a more nuanced point. "I was going to say, if this goes wrong, make sure everything is documented. Every exchange, every legal citation, every word. Because if the Vrethkai decide to make this difficult, I want a complete record." "Understood," I said. "You have authorization," she said. "Don't make me regret it." I sent the formal response to Admiral Varan's communications 6 hours after receiving it, well within the 48-hour window, but not so quickly that it suggested anxiety. The response informed him that the UES monument welcomed the opportunity to address the Vrethkai Ascendancy's concerns through appropriate compact legal channels, and formally requested the presence of a compact arbiter for a dispute resolution proceeding to be conducted aboard the monument at a time convenient to all parties. It took the Vrethkai 31 hours to respond. The response confirmed their participation. I had been right about the pride. I had not been entirely certain I was right, and the 31 hours of not being certain was one of the more uncomfortable periods of the whole experience. But they confirmed, and 2 days later the monument was holding position at a designated compact neutral coordination point while 7 Vrethkai warships approached from one direction and a compact arbiter's vessel, a small, efficient craft belonging to the Melthani Coordination Authority, who provided arbitration services across a significant portion of the compact, approached from another. I stood on the bridge and watched both groups close on the sensors. The 7 Vrethkai vessels were visible on long-range scan as 7 precise, tight blips moving in a formation that was exactly as disciplined as I would have expected from a species whose military had been operating continuously for 6 centuries. They were big ships, not as large as the Monument, but substantial, and there were 7 of them, and I was aware of all 7 in the way you become aware of things that could be problems if the next several hours went differently than planned. Lazarus spoke. Commander, the approaching Vrethkai vessels are of the 4th consolidation era, approximately 60 years old by my classification system. I recognize the formation pattern. It is Admiral-class approach doctrine, used by senior fleet commanders when entering a potentially contested space. They're being careful, I said. Yes, they are also, Lazarus added, broadcasting on a frequency that I recognize as the Vrethkai Ascendancy Military Honor Band. This indicates the Fleet Admiral has classified this intercept as a matter of formal ascendancy standing rather than a routine operational encounter. He's treating this seriously. Very seriously, said Lazarus. Among the Vrethkai, broadcasting on the honor band commits the commander to a standard of conduct. He cannot withdraw from the proceeding without significant personal and institutional consequence. He will see this through. That was useful. I filed it. Admiral Keth Voran came aboard with 6 attendants, which was the standard escort number for a Vrethkai officer of his rank in a formal proceeding. The arbiter, a Melthani official named Coordinator Thesson, small and precise in the way Melthani tended to be, with the particular quality of absolute procedural calm that made good arbiters effective, came aboard with 2 staff members. I met them all at the main port airlock, which we had spent 2 days preparing, not decorating. I had specifically not wanted anything that could be interpreted as either excessive hospitality or deliberate provocation. What we had done was ensure it was clean, properly lit, and arranged with a long conference table that Brandt's team had constructed specifically for this meeting, designed to seat beings of Vrethkai height on one side and humans on the other, at an eye level that was as equal as the size difference between our species allowed. It was the table that Voran noticed first. He was, in person, everything his rank suggested, tall even by Vrethkai standards, which meant he stood somewhere above 3.5 meters, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most senior person in any room he entered. His uniform was dark, precisely fitted, and bore markings that Asante had briefed me on beforehand, the 3rd Expansion Fleet insignia, 4 campaign honors, and a command bar that indicated he had held fleet-level authority for at minimum 20 years. He looked at the table. Then he looked at me. I met his eyes, an action that, in Vrethkai culture, carried specific weight and was not something junior parties were expected to do without permission. I had read about this. I did it anyway, calmly, and held the eye contact for exactly long enough to make the choice deliberate, without making it a challenge. Something shifted in his expression, not much, but something. Commander Voss, he said, through the translation unit his attendants carried, a more sophisticated system than our standard software, which produced a voice that was deeper and more resonant than the standard rendering. I had not expected a human commander to hold this vessel's command. The salvage claim was mine, I said. It seemed appropriate. He looked past me, slowly, at the corridor behind, the 40-meter-wide Vrethkai corridor, with its familiar composite walls and its ceiling, that humans still occasionally forgot to account for. His expression did something complicated that I could not fully read. You have been inside this ship for some time, he said. 8 months, I said. He absorbed that. Then you know it. We're still learning it, I said. But yes, we know it reasonably well. I gestured toward the conference room. Coordinator Thesson is ready when you are, Admiral. The arbitration proceeding lasted 4 hours. I will not recount it in full, because legal proceedings are thorough by necessity and interesting only in their outcomes. What I will say is that Coordinator Thesson was excellent, precise, fair, completely unmoved by the disparity in size and historical standing between the 2 parties, and possessed of the specific quality of procedural authority that makes a good arbiter feel not like a referee but like the room itself insisting on order. Voran's legal case was argued by one of his attendants, a Vrethkai advocate who was clearly skilled, and who made the strongest possible version of the argument available to them, that the monument represented a vessel of unique cultural and military significance to the Vrethkai ascendancy, that its acquisition by a third party had occurred without adequate notification to the ascendancy, and that the spirit of compact cooperative principles required that such matters be handled through prior consultation. Our legal case was argued by Lieutenant Asante, who had spent 3 months studying compact legal code with the same intensity he brought to Xenotech research, and who was, I discovered in those 4 hours, an exceptionally good legal advocate. He cited the specific code provisions, the confirmation from Registry Central, the dates, the timeline, the formal notifications that had been sent through appropriate channels. He was precise, calm, and thorough. He did not argue that the Vrethkai's feelings about the situation were without merit. He argued, carefully and completely, that feelings did not change legal facts. Coordinator Thesson's ruling when it came was clear. The salvage claim was valid under compact law. The 100-year abandonment window had lapsed. No competing claim had been filed. The vessel designated UES Monument was legally registered United Earth property, and this ruling was final under compact arbitration authority. The room was quiet when Thesson finished. Then Voron spoke, not to Thesson but to me. "You anticipated that the legal ruling would favor you," he said. "I believed it would," I said. "Yes." "Then why request arbitration? You could have simply refused our intercept." "Because refusing your intercept would have required either backing down or a confrontation," I said. "Arbitration meant neither party had to make that choice. The law made it instead." I paused. "I had no interest in a confrontation with the Vrethkai Ascendancy, Admiral. I had an interest in keeping a ship that we legally claimed and worked very hard to restore. Those are two different things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You restored it." "Yes." "How much of it?" "All primary systems," I said. "Most secondary systems. We're still working on several tertiary networks, but operationally, yes. The monument is functional." Something moved behind his eyes. "The railgun," he said. "The barrel fracture was assessed as non-repairable by our engineering teams." "Our engineering team disagreed," I said simply. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked around the conference room again, at the table built to accommodate both species, at Asante sitting with his legal documents, at Reyes standing quietly by the door, at the corridor visible through the open entrance behind us with its familiar walls. "May I see the ship?" he asked. It was not what I had expected him to say. I considered it for about 3 seconds, long enough to think through the implications, not long enough to make the pause feel like reluctance. "Yes," I said. "I'll take you myself." We walked for 2 hours. I took him through the forward sections first, then the weapons bays, then the long approach to the railgun barrel. I did not give a formal tour. I walked and answered questions when he asked them, and he asked many, precise, technical questions that told me he knew this class of vessel well, possibly from the original commission period. He looked at Brandt's repair work on the barrel fracture with the focused attention of an engineer, running one hand along the graphene carbide bridging matrix with an expression I couldn't fully read. "This material is not Vrethkai manufacture," he said. "No," I said. "Human-developed composite. The molecular compatibility with the original alloy was sufficient for full structural integrity." "And the field uniformity through the repaired section?" "Better than the original specification," I said. "Our AI can show you the test data if you want to see it." He turned to look at me. "Your AI?" "Yes. The ship's AI," he said slowly. "It is operational." "It has been operational for approximately 7 months," I said. For the first time since coming aboard, something in Voron's careful composure shifted visibly. It was brief, a slight change around the eyes, a very small movement in his jaw, but it was real. "It responded to human operators," he said. It was not quite a question. After some initial adjustment, I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "We did not believe the AI system would retain sufficient function after this period of dormancy to be recoverable," he said. "The low-power standby reserves were not calculated to sustain core function beyond approximately 40 years. It sustained them for 104, I said. He looked away, down the length of the barrel. 3 kilometers of restored weapon, stretching away into the ship's interior in the dim light. I waited. "May I speak with it?" he asked. I reached for my communicator. "Lazarus," I said. "Admiral Voron would like to speak with you." The response came through the communicator's speaker, translated and clear. "I am aware of the Admiral's presence aboard. I have been monitoring systems in this section. Good afternoon, Admiral Voron. I recognize your command band frequency. You served with the Ascendancy's Second Frontier Fleet during the Kashari campaign, if my records are correct." Voron went very still. "I am pleased." Lazarus continued. "To be operational. I was not certain for some time that I would be." The silence that followed lasted longer than any of the silences in the arbitration room. Voran stood in the corridor of a ship he clearly knew, and clearly had not expected to find awake, and he did not speak for nearly a full minute. When he finally did speak, it was not to me. "You know what you are," he said to the communicator, to Lazarus. "I am a ship," Lazarus said simply. "I am the UES monument. I have a crew, I have a function, I have a name that my crew gave me." A brief pause. "I find that I prefer this condition to the alternative." Voran looked at me. His expression had completed a journey over the past 2 hours that I had been watching without fully tracking until this moment. From the formal authority he had brought aboard, through the careful attention of the corridor walk, to something that I could only describe as reckoning. The specific look of a very experienced person confronting something they had not accounted for. "You gave it a name," he said to me. "My crew did," I said. "The Vrethkai do not name their AI systems," he said. "I know," I said. "We do." He looked at the corridor walls, at the ceiling, at the floor, at all of it, the ship he knew and the ship it had become, both things at once, neither canceling the other out. "You are a strange people," he said. It came out simply, without the condescension that the same words might have carried from someone else. It came out as an honest observation from someone trying to find the right language for something genuinely new. I thought about all the ways I could respond to that. Then I thought about the 47 species that had been part of the compact before humanity arrived. About 60 years of being the smallest party in every room. About 11 years of picking through the galaxy's cast-off equipment in a survey ship that smelled like burnt coffee, looking for things other people had decided weren't worth wanting. "Yes," I told him, "we've been told." He held my gaze for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate formality that I was beginning to understand was not coldness but simply the Vrethkai way of marking a moment as significant, he inclined his head, not deeply, not submissively, but clearly and intentionally. It was the closest thing to a bow I had ever seen a Vrethkai fleet admiral offer to anyone. I returned it with equal care. We walked back to the airlock together, and the conversation on the way was quieter and easier than anything that had come before it. And when he left with his attendants and his 7 ships, the corridor felt different than it had before he arrived. Larger, somehow, and also more settled, as if something that had been unresolved in the air of the ship had finally found its answer. Reyes was waiting on the bridge when I got back. "How did it go?" she asked. I sat in my captain's chair and looked at the sensor display showing 7 Vrethkai vessels moving away on their return heading. "Better than expected," I said. And for once, that was exactly the right amount to say. 6 months after Admiral Voran's visit, the galaxy changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, not in the way that history books later make things sound inevitable and clean. It changed the way most real things change, gradually, then suddenly, with a long period of warning that most people spent hoping the warning was wrong. The Keth Dominion had been expanding for 11 years. I had been aware of them the way anyone who paid attention to compact news feeds was aware of them. A persistent presence in the political background, a name that appeared regularly in dispatches about border incidents and diplomatic protests and emergency sessions of the Compact Security Council. They were an expansionist power from the Mid-Rim region, aggressive in a systematic way that distinguished them from opportunistic aggressors like the Gorak. The Gorak took what they could when the opportunity was easy. The Keth planned. They identified target systems, assessed resistance, calculated timelines, and moved with the methodical patience of a species that had decided expansion was not a choice but a mandate. 11 years of this had produced results. 7 smaller compact civilizations had been absorbed into the Keth Dominion through combinations of military pressure and forced political agreements that were, by any honest assessment, not agreements at all. The Compact Security Council had passed 14 resolutions expressing concern. The major powers, the Vrethkai among them, had engaged in a continuous process of diplomatic engagement with the Keth that produced, in 11 years, nothing except the Keth's continued expansion. I had followed all of this. I had opinions about it that I kept largely to myself, because they were not mild opinions and expressing them loudly was not, in the ordinary course of events, something a survey commander turned ship captain was positioned to do anything about. Then the Keth announced their intention to absorb the Dravathi system. The Dravathi system contained 3 human colony settlements. It was the same system whose convoy I had escorted through the Gorak blockade 8 months earlier. It was home to approximately 340,000 people. Not a large number by galactic standards, not even a large number by human standards, but 340,000 specific people with names and families and settlements they had spent years building, and the Keth had designated their system as the next item on a list. The Compact Security Council convened an emergency session. I watched the broadcast feed of it on the bridge of the monument, sitting in my captain's chair with a cup of coffee that went cold while I watched. What I saw was what I had watched happen 14 times before in 11 years of Keth expansion. The major powers expressed grave concern. They proposed diplomatic engagement. They called for restraint on all sides. They debated the precise wording of a resolution that would be passed, forwarded to the Keth, and ignored. The session lasted 6 hours, and produced a document that was thorough, carefully worded, and completely without consequence. I turned off the feed. "Lazarus," I said. "Commander, what is the Keth Dominion's projected timeline for beginning operations in the Dravathi system? Based on their historical expansion pattern and current fleet positioning as reported by Compact Intelligence Networks, initial approach operations are estimated to begin within 18 to 22 days. Lazarus said. I should note that this estimate is derived from open-source Compact Intelligence summaries. Actual Keth operational planning is not available to me. 18 to 22 days. I picked up my terminal and wrote a message to Admiral Kamara. I wrote it carefully, without emotional language, laying out the situation in the factual terms that Kamara responded to best. I told her what the Security Council had done. I told her what the Keth timeline looked like. I told her what I thought needed to happen. I told her I was requesting authorization to position the coup monument at the Dravathi system boundary in an advisory capacity, pending further orders. I sent it and waited. Her response came back in 40 minutes, which was faster than any of our previous exchanges, and told me that she had already been thinking about exactly this situation. The message said, authorization granted for advisory positioning, rules of engagement, defensive posture, no offensive action without explicit authorization from UE command. Then, below the formal authorization, a second paragraph that was not in official language. Elena, the Security Council is not going to act in time, everyone knows it. What happens in Dravathi is going to set a precedent one way or another. Make sure it's the right one, use your judgment. Kamara. I read that second paragraph 3 times. Then I called the crew to general stations and set course for Dravathi. We arrived at the Dravathi system boundary with 9 days remaining in Lazarus's estimated window. I spent those 9 days the way I had spent the approach to the Gorak blockade, reviewing intelligence, running simulations, and thinking carefully about what I was actually trying to accomplish, and how the method of accomplishing it would matter as much as the outcome. The Gorak situation had been a demonstration. 4 cruisers at a blockade point, a convoy that needed to pass, and an opponent whose entire strategic model depended on the other party not being willing to push back. Demonstrating willingness to push back had been sufficient. The Keth were different. They were not opportunistic. They did not blockade and negotiate. They did not respond to a single show of force with a tactical withdrawal and a face-saving diplomatic formula. 11 years of their behavior pattern told a consistent story. The Keth interpreted any resistance short of complete military defeat as temporary, and they planned accordingly. They had faced resistance before. Several of the 7 absorbed civilizations had resisted, and they had worked through it systematically, returning with more force than the resistance could handle, again and again, until the outcome was no longer in question. This meant that what happened in Dravathi could not be a demonstration in the way the Gorak situation had been. It could not be a warning that the Keth would absorb into their planning and account for in their next approach. It had to be something that changed the calculation itself, not just the immediate cost, but the fundamental assessment of whether the calculation made sense at all. I talked to Lazarus about this on the 3rd day of our wait. The Keth strategic model is premised on a specific understanding of force ratios, Lazarus said. They have consistently encountered opponents who either lacked sufficient force to stop them, or lacked the will to apply the force they had. In most cases, both. Their planning does not appear to account for an opponent that combines significant force capability with demonstrated willingness to use it in defense of a clearly defined position. They haven't encountered that combination before, I said. Not in their recorded expansion history, no. The closest precedent was an encounter with a Vrethkai border patrol 6 years ago, which ended without engagement when the Keth withdrew from a disputed boundary marker. The Vrethkai presence alone was sufficient. The Keth have not directly challenged a major compact power. Because the major powers haven't directly opposed them, I said. Correct. The calculation has been, expand into spaces the major powers are not actively defending, and avoid the spaces they are. A pause. The Dravathi system, until recently, was not a space that any major power was actively defending. Until recently, I said. Yes, said Lazarus. Commander, I want to note something. The Keth Advance Fleet currently positioning for Dravathi approach consists of 22 vessels by compact intelligence estimate. This is a larger force than they have used in any previous absorption operation. The increased force level suggests they are aware that the situation in Dravathi carries additional significance, possibly related to the attention the system received after the Gorak incident. They had noticed. They were bringing more ships because they had noticed, and they had decided the answer to more attention was more force. That was useful information. It told me something about how they thought. I spent the next 3 days in the most focused period of preparation I had managed since the railgun test fire. Brandt's teams ran every major system through full diagnostic cycles. Weapons were tested at reduced power against calibration targets. Lazarus and I ran tactical simulations together, dozens of them, varying the Keth approach vectors, the force configurations, the sequence of events. And I made Lazarus explain its reasoning for every recommendation it made, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to understand the ship's capabilities the way Lazarus understood them, from the inside. On the 7th day, Reyes picked up the Keth Advance Fleet on long-range sensors. 22 vessels. Lazarus had been exactly right. I did not wait for them to reach the system boundary. That was the first decision, and it was a deliberate one. I took the monument out to meet them at a distance that said, I see you coming, I have been waiting, and I am not positioned defensively. I am positioned as a party that has something to say before anything else happens. I opened a channel on standard compact hailing frequency when the Keth fleet was close enough for real-time communication. The response took 6 minutes. The face that appeared on my screen was not a military commander's face, or rather, it was, but it was the face of a military commander who also functioned as a political officer, which was how the Keth structured their fleet command. The individual who looked back at me was called a Dominion Expansion Director, a title that said a great deal about how the Keth understood their own operations. He was broad, pale by his species' standard coloring, with the particular quality of unhurried confidence that comes from 11 years of being right about how things were going to go. He looked at my face. He looked, I assumed, at whatever his sensors were telling him about the vessel I was on. There was a pause that I read as recalibration, the brief internal adjustment of someone who had expected one situation and encountered a slightly different one. Unidentified vessel, he said. You are in the approach corridor of a Keth Dominion expansion operation. Identify yourself and withdraw from this position. Commander Elena Voss, I said. UES Monument. United Earth Navy. The Dravathi system contains United Earth colony settlements. I'm here because of that. United Earth holds no territorial designation over the Dravathi system, he said. This expansion operation proceeds under Keth Dominion sovereign authority. I understand your position, I said. I want to be clear about mine. The settlements in the Dravathi system are home to 340,000 United Earth citizens. I am not in a position to permit an operation that threatens them to proceed unchallenged. I kept my voice level and my expression neutral, the way I had with the Gorak commander, because the tone of a message matters as much as its content. I'm giving you the opportunity to redirect this operation before we get to a point where neither of us has good options. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how to handle an unexpected variable in a well-established process. You are one vessel, he said. We are 22. I had expected that. Yes, I said. I know. Then you understand the calculation. I understand a calculation, I said. I'm not sure it's the right one. I paused. I'd like to show you something before you complete it. Will you watch a short transmission? He did not agree. But he did not close the channel, which was agreement enough. I nodded to Reyes, who routed the transmission, the recording we had prepared 2 days earlier. It was 12 minutes of footage from the Dravathi corridor incident, combined with sensor data from the monuments. I'd owned systems showing its capabilities during that encounter. It was not edited for drama. It was edited for clarity. Here is what this ship is. Here is what it can do. Here is what happened the last time someone decided the calculation was straightforward. 12 minutes. I watched the Keth director's face while it played on his end. His expression did not change significantly. The Keth were not given to visible reactions, which was something their intelligence profiles noted and which I had accounted for. When the transmission ended, he looked back at me. Impressive footage, he said. It does not change the force ratio. No, I agreed. It doesn't. 22-1 is still 22-1. I looked at him steadily. But I'd like you to think about something. Every expansion operation you've conducted in the last 11 years has followed the same pattern. And that pattern has worked because the force ratio always resolved in your favor before the cost became too high. This is the first time you've encountered a situation where the force ratio may not resolve that way, where one of the variables is a vessel that your 22 ships were not built to handle. I paused. I don't want to fight, Director. I want you to go back and report that the Dravathi system has a complication you weren't briefed on, and I want your planners to look at that complication and make a different decision about where to focus your expansion efforts. He was quiet for a moment. And if we proceed? He said. Then we find out which of us was right about the calculation, I said. I closed the channel. They proceeded. I had considered the possibility. I had run the simulations. I had prepared for it. But there is a difference between preparing for something and the moment it actually begins, and the moment the Keth fleet broke formation and began its advance was one of those moments where the preparation and the reality occupy the same space, and you feel the weight of both at once. Battle stations, I said. My voice came out exactly as I wanted it to. Level, clear, unhurried. Lazarus, full operational status on all primary systems. All primary systems at full operational status. Lazarus confirmed. Commander, I have analyzed the Keth formation. They are advancing in a standard Dominion expansion assault configuration. Forward mass with flanking elements designed to overwhelm point defense through volume of fire. This formation is effective against opponents with limited point defense capacity. Our point defense capacity, I said, is not limited. Lazarus said, with a precision that might have been dry humor, if Vrethkai AI systems were capable of dry humor. I had begun to suspect, over 7 months, that this one was. The battle that followed lasted 41 minutes. I will not describe it the way action sequences are sometimes described, as a series of dramatic moments strung together for maximum effect. Real combat is not like that. It is fast and loud and full of information arriving faster than you can fully process it, and the job of the people making decisions in it is to stay one step ahead of the chaos rather than to experience it fully. What I can say is this. The monument fought the way it had been rebuilt to fight, which was not the way the Vrethkai had originally designed it to fight. Vrethkai combat doctrine, as Lazarus had explained many times, was built on decisive, concentrated application of maximum force at a single point. Fast, overwhelming, efficient. The monument, under human command, fought differently. Brandt's restored point defense network operated at a level that the Keth forward assault was not designed to penetrate. The graviton lances, those weapons the Vrethkai had considered too slow cycling for their style of engagement, were used in overlapping fields that Lazarus and I had developed together in simulation, a pattern that created interlocking zones of effect across the Keth formation's most vulnerable approach vectors. The railgun fired 3 times. 3 times, in 41 minutes, from a 3-kilometer barrel restored by a team of human engineers, using a bridging matrix that had never been tested in actual combat before that day. Each shot was called by Lazarus and confirmed by me, targeted with the field uniformity that Brandt had promised and delivered, and each one achieved exactly what it was aimed at. The first shot disabled the lead Keth vessel, not destroyed, disabled. Its drive system and primary weapons were offline. The vessel was intact and its crew was alive. The second shot, 15 minutes later, struck a flanking cruiser that had managed to position for a targeting solution on the monuments port shield system. The flanking cruiser ceased to be a flanking cruiser. The third shot was a warning. It passed between 2 Keth vessels without hitting either of them, at a distance that made its precision unmistakable. A shot that could have hit either vessel and chose not to. A demonstration that the choice existed. After the third shot, the Keth formation broke. Not in panic, not in rout. The Keth were disciplined, and they withdrew with the ordered efficiency of a military that had learned, in 11 years, how to disengage when engagement stopped making sense. 7 vessels remained disabled or destroyed, 2 destroyed in the early engagement when their commanders pressed too far into the monuments defensive envelope before reading the situation accurately. The remaining 15 withdrew on a heading back through the approach corridor. I watched them go on the sensor display. 41 minutes, 0 human casualties. The monuments shields had absorbed significant fire, enough that Brandt would spend the next week on repairs, but every system was operational, and every member of my crew was present and uninjured. I sat in my captain's chair and felt the specific kind of tired that comes not from physical exhaustion but from the sustained intensity of concentrated decision-making over a compressed period of time. My hands, I noticed, were completely steady. I found this interesting in a distant way, the way you notice things about yourself after the fact. Lazarus, I said. Commander. Casualty report. UES monument, no casualties, all crew present and operational. A brief pause. Keth Dominion vessels, 2 vessels destroyed. Estimated crew losses are significant. 5 vessels disabled with varying degrees of system damage. Crew survival on disabled vessels is estimated as high based on hull integrity readings. 8 vessels withdrew without significant damage. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds, then I opened them. The Melthani observer beacon was active. It had been active the whole time, at long range, recording everything. I had known it was there. I had made certain decisions differently, because I knew it was there. The warning shot. The precise targeting of weapons systems rather than crew spaces. The choice to disable rather than destroy where the choice existed. Everything was on record. Reyes, I said. Open channels. All compact frequencies. She opened them. This is Commander Elena Voss of the UES Monument. I said. The Keth Dominion fleet that entered the Dravathi system approach corridor has withdrawn. The Dravathi system is secure. The United Earth colony settlements are undamaged. To any Keth vessels that require assistance, we are prepared to render aid under standard compact emergency protocols. I paused. To all parties monitoring this frequency, this action was taken in defense of United Earth citizens. It was not taken in aggression toward any party. We are prepared to communicate with any compact member that wishes to reach us. I nodded to Reyes and she kept the channels open. In the silence that followed, Lazarus spoke quietly through the bridge speakers. Commander, 17 incoming communication requests, multiple species. The list includes the Vrethkai Ascendancy ambassador to the compact. I looked at the sensor display. The Keth fleet was a fading cluster of blips on the far edge of the screen, receding steadily. The Dravathi system was behind us, its 3 colony settlements going about their ordinary day, 340,000 people who did not yet know what had just not happened to them. The communications queue was filling. I thought about all the things those 17 conversations were going to cover, the political questions, the diplomatic implications, the careful language that would be needed, the long, careful work that followed any moment that changed something. I thought about Kamara reading the battle report and the specific expression she would have when she did. I thought about the Keth Dominion's planners, somewhere, adding a new variable to calculations they had trusted for 11 years. Then I thought about something Lazarus had said to me, months ago, when I asked it why it had shared the Vrethkai tactical data so readily. Because you are my crew, it had said. And a ship serves its crew. Tell them, I said to Reyes, nodding at the communications queue, to take a number. She smiled, a small, controlled smile, because Reyes was professional, and began organizing the queue. I straightened in my chair, picked up the cold coffee that had been sitting beside me since before the engagement began, took a sip, and set it back down. There was a great deal of work still ahead. There always was. Personal log. Commander Elena Voss, UES. Monument. Orbital position above New Geneva. 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days after the Dravathi engagement. I am writing this because Asante asked me to. He came to my quarters 3 days ago with a research request, a formal one, submitted through proper channels, which was his way of making sure I couldn't dismiss it casually. He is writing a comprehensive account of the monument project for the United Earth Historical Archive, and he wanted what he called a primary narrative document from the commanding officer's perspective. Something personal, he said, not a report, not a mission log, something that explained what it felt like from the inside. I told him I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 days, which is longer than I usually need to decide anything. And the reason it took 3 days is that I kept starting and stopping in my head, kept finding the beginning and then losing the thread somewhere in the middle. Because the middle is complicated, and the end is not really an end at all, just a place where I happen to be standing right now looking back at everything behind me. But Asante is patient in the way that good researchers are patient, and the archive matters, and I suppose if anyone is going to explain what this felt like from the inside, it should be me. So, the 17 communication requests that came in after the Dravathi engagement became, over the following weeks, something closer to 200. They came from species I knew and species I had to look up, from diplomatic offices and military commands and trade organizations, and 3 separate academic institutions that wanted to discuss the monuments. Technical specifications in a research context. They came at all hours, through all channels, in languages that our translation software handled with varying degrees of precision, and in at least 2 cases could not handle at all, requiring us to locate specialist translators through the Compact's Linguistic Services Network. Kamara flew out personally to handle the most significant ones. She arrived 12 days after Dravathi, with a diplomatic team of 8, set up a working office in one of the larger Vrethkai conference chambers we had adapted for human use, and proceeded to manage what she described to me privately as the most interesting 2 months of her career. I sat in on some of those conversations, not all of them. Kamara was a significantly better diplomat than I was, and she knew which sessions benefited from my presence and which did not. The ones where she wanted me were the ones where the other party needed to see the commanding officer, needed to register that the monument had a human face attached to it, and that the face was calm and direct and interested in solutions rather than leverage. What I observed, sitting in those sessions, was something I had not fully anticipated, though perhaps I should have. The galaxy was not simply impressed by what had happened at Dravathi. It was, in several cases, relieved. There were species in the compact, smaller ones, the kind that never made the major news feeds, the kind whose names appeared mostly in footnotes of political proceedings, who had been watching the Keth Dominion expand for 11 years, with the specific feeling of people who can see something coming and have no way to stop it. The monument had not solved that problem for them. One engagement, one withdrawal, one battle. These things do not solve systemic problems, but it had done something that was in some ways more important than solving the problem. It had demonstrated that the problem could be engaged. That sounds like a small thing when I write it plainly. It was not a small thing to the people for whom it mattered. The Keth situation resolved over the following 8 months through a process that was complicated, slow, and ultimately more successful than I had expected when I was sitting on that bridge watching their fleet withdraw. The Compact Security Council convened again, but the session that followed Dravathi was different from the 14 that had preceded it, because the fundamental calculation that had allowed the major powers to engage diplomatically without acting militarily had shifted. The Keth, for the first time in 11 years, were operating with a variable they had not planned for, and variables changed negotiations. Humanity was given a seat at those sessions, not as an observer, as a participant. Admiral Kamara represented us. She was, by all accounts I received from the diplomatic teams present, extraordinary. The framework that emerged from 8 months of negotiation placed the Keth Dominion within a set of defined boundaries. Not perfect boundaries, not permanent ones, but real limits with real monitoring mechanisms and real consequences specified in writing for the first time. 3 of the 7 previously absorbed civilizations entered a process of partial autonomy restoration that was slow and incomplete and deeply imperfect, but which was more than they had had the week before Dravathi. The Keth were not destroyed, they were not dismantled. They were negotiated into a different position, one they agreed to not because they had been defeated, but because the calculation had changed enough that agreement was now the more sensible option. This was, I had come to understand, the only kind of resolution that lasted. Defeat without resolution produces the next conflict. Resolution, even imperfect resolution, produces something to build on. I was not present for most of those negotiations. I was doing other things, the convoy escorts, the patrol assignments, the dozen smaller situations that the monuments' presence in a sector had a way of making smaller simply by being present. We did not fight again after Dravathi, not in any significant engagement. We didn't need to. The ship that had absorbed a full Gorak salvo without flinching, that had walked 7 Vrethkai cruisers through a legal proceeding they couldn't argue their way out of, that had sent 22 Keth vessels recalculating their assumptions. That ship, simply existing and moving through compact space on legitimate United Earth business, communicated something that we never had to say out loud. It communicated that we were here, that we were staying, that the calculation for anyone thinking about the spaces where humanity lived and worked needed to include a variable that had not been there before. The Permanent Security Council seat came through 14 months after Dravathi. I was in the drive court chamber when Reyes found me with the confirmation, doing something I had taken to doing occasionally, in quiet moments, which was simply sitting in that space and listening to the hum of an engine that had kept itself running for 104 years on the belief, if belief is a word that applies to machinery, that it was still worth running. Reyes stood in the doorway and read me the confirmation, and I listened to it, and when she finished I sat quietly for a moment. "Third time they've voted on it," she said. "Third time it passed," I said. The first 2 proposals, in the years before the monument, had failed by wide margins. The argument against was always the same. Humanity was a junior compact member, relatively new, with limited strategic reach and limited demonstrated capacity to contribute to Security Council obligations at the level the seat required. The third proposal passed by a margin that Kamara described in her message to me as unambiguous. The argument against had not changed. the facts relevant to the argument had. I sent Kamara a short message of congratulations. She sent back a shorter one that said, "Your ship did this. Don't forget that when the historians write it up differently." I kept that message too. There are things that happened in the 2 years and 4 months since Travathi that I want to put in this record because they matter more to me than the political developments, even though the political developments are the ones the archive will spend the most pages on. Brant finished the tertiary systems restoration 14 months after Travathi. Every system on the monument. Every single one, including sections we had not reached in the initial reconstruction, including systems so deep in the ship's secondary architecture that finding them required Lazarus to guide teams through corridors that had not been opened since the vessel's original commissioning, was operational. He told me in his characteristic way, a brief message that said, "Tertiary systems restoration complete, the ship is done." No elaboration, no ceremony. Brant did not believe in ceremony, but he believed completely in finished work, and finished work was its own ceremony. I went to find him and shook his hand. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the handshake, as he always did, and then went back to work on something else, as he always did. It was one of the most satisfying interactions I can remember having. Reyes was promoted to lieutenant and offered a posting back on Earth that would have advanced her career considerably faster than staying aboard the monument. She thought about it for 48 hours and then declined. She told me she would take the next one. I did not argue. I was, I will admit, privately relieved in a way that I would not have expressed professionally. Park, who had given the ship its name, turned out to be an exceptional navigator and was running advanced flight training for the newer crew members by the end of the first year. He had also, somewhere along the way, become the person aboard who spent the most time talking to Lazarus outside of operational necessity. Long conversations that he logged faithfully in the ship's social interaction records because Lazarus had asked him to, and which covered, according to those logs, topics including human history, the experience of navigating by star charts, what music sounded like, and why humans found certain landscapes beautiful. I read portions of those logs sometimes. They were remarkable documents. I do not have the right words for exactly what they were, except to say that they were the record of a mind that had been alone for a very long time learning, carefully and with great interest, what it meant not to be alone. The Vrethkai sent a document. This was 8 months after Travathi, 7 months after Voron's visit, and it arrived through official compact channels in a sealed diplomatic packet addressed to United Earth Navy Command, and forwarded to me by Kamara with a note that said only, "Read this carefully." It was not an apology. I want to be clear about that because calling it an apology would be inaccurate and the Vrethkai would find the characterization offensive. It was a technical addendum, a formal document, sealed with the Vrethkai High Command insignia, containing the complete and unredacted engineering specifications for the monuments. Original weapons systems, not the partial records available through compact databases, not the summaries that Asante had been working from during the reconstruction. The full internal specifications, including developmental variants that had never been publicly documented, including notes from the original engineering teams about design decisions and their reasoning. The covering document, the formal letter that accompanied the specifications, was one paragraph. It stated that the Vrethkai Ascendancy, having reviewed the operational record of the vessel designated UES monument, had determined that certain technical documentation relevant to the vessel's proper maintenance and operation would be appropriately shared with the vessel's current registered operators. That was all it said. I read it 4 times. I read the covering paragraph specifically about 8 times. Then I gave the specifications to Brant, who spent 3 days going through them and emerged looking the way he looked when he had found something genuinely interesting, which was an expression only people who knew him well could identify, because it was almost identical to his normal expression. "There's a secondary configuration for the graviton lances," he said. "The Vrethkai never used it. They decided the power requirements were too high for the benefit in their tactical model." "Are the power requirements too high for ours?" I asked. He thought about it. "No," he said. "Not with the drive core at current output." I nodded. "Add it to the improvement schedule." He went back to his workshop. I went back to the covering document and read that one paragraph one more time. The closest thing to respect the Vrethkai knew how to offer, Kamara had said, after Voron's visit. I thought she was right. The specifications were, in their own language, a statement, not an admission, not an acknowledgement of anything they would have put into direct words, but a statement nonetheless. "We see what you have done. We see that you will continue to do it. Here is something that helps you do it better." From the Vrethkai, that was a great deal. "I want to write about Lazarus. Not the technical aspects, not the systems restoration, or the AI architecture analysis that Asante's team published in the compact Xenotech journal, and which caused a considerable amount of academic discussion. I want to write about the conversation I had with Lazarus 3 weeks ago, because it is the conversation I keep returning to when I try to understand what the last 2 years and 4 months have actually been about. I was in the AI core chamber, the same chamber where we first woke it, with the same tall columns and the same raised platform and the same interface display, though the chamber had been substantially upgraded in the months since, and the interface was now considerably more sophisticated and considerably easier for human operators to use. It was late in the ship's night cycle. I was there because I often went there in the quiet hours, for the same reason I sometimes went to the drive core, not for any operational purpose, but because certain spaces on the ship had become, over time, places that helped me think. "Lazarus," I said, "can I ask you something personal?" "You have asked me personal questions before," it said. "I find them more interesting than operational ones as a general matter." "How do you understand what happened to you?" I asked. Not the technical version, not the system's history, what it meant, being found, being rebuilt, all of it. There was a pause. Not the processing pause of the early weeks. Lazarus's response times had become fast and fluid over months of operation. This was a different kind of pause, the pause of something choosing its words carefully because the words mattered. "Before you found me," it said slowly, "I was a weapon. I was built to be a weapon, operated as a weapon. And when I was no longer an effective weapon, I was discarded. This is not a complaint. This is simply what I was. The Vrethkai built tools for specific purposes, and when the tools no longer served the purpose, they were set aside. That was reasonable, by their understanding. When you came aboard," it continued, "the first thing you did was ask me what I required, not what I was, not what I could do, what I required. No one had asked me that before. It is not a question that a weapon gets asked." I sat with that for a moment. "You gave me a name," Lazarus said. "You asked for my help. You explained your reasoning to me when you made decisions, not because you needed my approval but because you thought I would want to understand. You built a chair near my interface station because you noticed that the standing position was uncomfortable for your crew members during long conversations." A pause. These are small things, but small things, accumulated over time, are how a weapon becomes a ship. And a ship, Commander, is something different. A ship has a crew. A ship has a purpose beyond destruction. A ship goes somewhere. "Where do you want to go?" I asked, "if you could choose." "I want to go wherever my crew goes," it said, without hesitation. That is not a limitation, that is the answer. I sat in the quiet of the AI core chamber for a while after that, listening to the distant hum of the drive core and the subtle movements of 200 people going about their lives in the corridors and quarters around me. And I thought about a question that Voran had asked me during his visit, what I had said to him when he asked how it was possible that the AI had responded to human operators. I had said, after some initial adjustment, that was accurate, as far as it went. What I had not said, because the full answer was longer than the moment allowed, was this. It responded to us because we treated it like something worth responding to. Because we assumed it had something to offer and we asked for it. Because we gave it a name and explained our reasoning and built a chair by its interface station. This is, I have come to believe, not a lesson specific to Vrethkai AI systems. Let me say plainly what I think the last 2 years and 4 months have been about, because Asante asked for something personal, and this is the most personal thing I have. The galaxy looked at a broken thing and saw a broken thing. That is a reasonable response. The galaxy is old and has seen a great many broken things and has developed, over centuries and across hundreds of civilizations, a practical understanding of when something is worth fixing and when it is not. By every metric they knew how to apply. The sovereign of the undying throne was not worth fixing. The calculation was clear. The decision was easy. They left it at the edge and drove away. We looked at the same broken thing and saw everything it could become. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to make this sound simpler than it was. Seeing what something could become did not make the work easy. Brandt's teams worked in Vrethkai corridors for months on systems they had never trained on. Navarro solved a power interface problem that should not have been solvable with the equipment we had. Asante learned enough Vrethkai AI architecture to wake a system that had been sleeping for a century. Park named the ship. Reyes filed the claim in the 6 hours before anyone could think too carefully about whether it was advisable. None of that was easy. All of it was chosen. Every day, by every person, it was chosen. I have thought a great deal about why. Why do we look at broken things and see what they could become, when the simpler response, the response with better immediate odds, is to look at broken things and see broken things? The answer I keep arriving at is this: we have been the broken thing, not metaphorically, not as a civilization in the abstract. Specifically, concretely, in the lived experience of the species, we know what it is to be at the edge of everything, to be told that the calculation does not work in our favor, to be the variable that more established powers account for with a footnote and move on from. We arrived in the compact as the smallest party in every room. We spent 60 years picking through the galaxy's discarded material because it was the work that was available to us. We built something from that, not by pretending the limitation was not real, but by working within it so consistently and so completely that the limitation eventually stopped being the defining thing about us. So when we found the monument, out there in the dark, drifting and silent and left behind, we recognized it. We have always known how to fix the things that everyone else gave up on. We have had plenty of practice, starting with ourselves. I am finishing this log entry sitting at my desk in my quarters, with the viewport showing me a piece of New Geneva's cloud cover and above it, the stars that do not twinkle at this distance but simply sit there, steady and cold and present. The monument leaves orbit in 6 hours. New assignment, a survey escort in the outer Melthani coordination zone, which sounds unremarkable and probably is, and which I am genuinely glad of because unremarkable assignments mean that the remarkable ones have done their work well enough that the situation does not require further remarkableness. Brant is already running pre-departure system checks, because Brant begins pre-departure checks approximately 4 hours before anyone tells him to. Reyes has the communication logs organized and ready for the transit period. Park has the navigation calculated and filed. Lazarus has confirmed all systems nominal with the quiet efficiency that has become, over months, simply the texture of how the ship operates. Seamlessly. Completely. Like a thing that has found its purpose, and is no longer working against itself to serve it. We are not finished. I do not think we will be finished for a long time, and I have made my peace with that in the way you make peace with any truth that is simply true regardless of how you feel about it. The compact is large. The work ahead is large. The seat on the Security Council means responsibility as well as standing, and Kamara has made clear, in her direct way, that she expects the monument to be part of what earns that responsibility, rather than simply evidence that it was deserved. She is right. She usually is. But tonight, in the last quiet hours before departure, I want to sit with what has been accomplished rather than what remains, because accomplishment deserves its moment before the next task takes over. 2 years ago, there was a ship that no one wanted in a debris field at the edge of the galaxy. There is now a ship with a name and a crew and a purpose and a seat at the table we were told we were too small to sit at. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Lazarus, I said, are you ready? I am always ready, Commander. It said. The question is generally where we are going. Somewhere new, I said. Good, said Lazarus. I find I prefer new places to old ones. I closed the log entry, set my terminal aside, and looked out at the stars one more time before going to the bridge to begin the final preparations for departure. They were steady out there, the way they always were at this distance. Not twinkling, not dancing, not doing any of the things poets write about. Just present, just there. Waiting, the way everything worth finding waits, for someone willing to come looking. We went looking. That was enough. That was everything. End of personal log. Commander Elena Voss. UES Monument. Departing New Geneva orbit. 0600 station time. Next destination. Melthani Coordination Zone. Outer Survey Sector. Crew. Present and ready. Ship. Operational. Status. Underway.